Components are great if you have certain pieces of HTML, certain HTML blocks, like here, which you reuse in different parts of your page, like here, where we create multiple list items, where you then have a certain functionality that should be enclosed in that HTML block, and that should be specific to this HTML block. Components can also be great to splitting your big application into multiple smaller chunks, but that's something we'll explore later automatically once we work more and more with components. So, since components seem to be very helpful, how can we create such a component? How does it work? A component is an official feature Vue.js knows. And we can create one on an app. So on an app we created with create app, by using that app, which in my case here is stored in that app constant, and calling the component method on it. This tells Vue that we want to create a new component. Now this component method needs two things. The first thing is an identifier, because a component, and that's important, you have to memorize this, a component is basically like a custom HTML element. So here you define your own HTML tag. And that could, for example, be user-contact or friend-contact, something like this. You should always use an identifier that contains a dash. So you should always have component names, custom HTML tags therefore, which contain a dash, so which are made up of two words. The reason for that is simple. This avoids that you potentially clash with official built-in HTML elements. For example, if I would name my component h2, well, there already is a h2 element, and that would therefore clash. Therefore, a simple rule is that you should use multi-word component names, so custom HTML tags, because all built-in HTML elements are single-word elements. So that's now my own HTML element name, which we will later be able to use. This is the identifier of our component, so to say. The second argument you pass to this component method is a config object, just as you pass it to create app. Because, and that's another important piece of information to keep in mind, a Vue component is essentially just another Vue app. Just an app that belongs to another app. So this component, which we're creating here, is a new Vue app, but, and that's the important thing, an app which will be connected to our main app. So components are like mini apps, you could say. So therefore they can also have data, they can have methods, and therefore here our component can have its own data, where we, for example, have a details are visible property, which initially is false. We can also add methods to our component and add our toggle details method here to the methods of my own component, so that we then toggle this component specific data with this component specific method. And we can remove methods from the main app now, and also get rid of details are visible there. We could also keep it here. We wouldn't have a clash, because this component is essentially encapsulated. It does not communicate with the parent app, so with the app it belongs to. But we can still remove this property because we don't need it in the main app anymore. So now we got our component, friend contact. And how do we now use this component, and how does it work? Well, this component misses one important thing before we can use it, and that's a template. Since this is a new app, it needs its own template. Our main app has a template, this whole section, which we mounted the app to, but our component now is a mini app and needs its own template. Now here we don't mount this component, we don't call mount on it, so that's not how we will connect it to HTML. Instead here, for the moment, we'll add this template option, which I also showed in the deep dive, in the behind the scenes module. In case you skipped that, yes, there is a template option which you can add to your Vue apps, also to the main app, to define the template of that app. So to define the HTML code of that app. And you need to do that for this component. Now, I will already say that later in the course, in the next modules, we will learn about a much nicer way of defining those templates. But for the moment, I'll just create a multi-line string here with backticks. So these are not single quotes, these are backticks, which is a different character on the keyboard. And I will now grab this list item here, so this entire code, and cut it from my HTML file and instead add it here in this backticked string. And I'm using backticks because they allow me to write a multi-line string like this. But in the end, that's just a JavaScript string now, with all those Vue features in it though. Now I will remove that v-for code on the list item, and to make sure the interpolations work, for the moment, I will add a friend property to the data of that component. So not friends, but friend. And I will just copy one friend which I defined here. Let's take Manuel and store him in this friend key. This is just temporary. We'll soon make it work with our list again. But to get started, we'll just use friend like that. And now if I save that, we can finally start using our own component and therefore our own HTML element. Because now we can go to index.html, and inside of our main apps template, we can now use friend contact as if it would be an official HTML element. And it's not. I really want to emphasize it. This is not an HTML element which the browser would know. If you try to use that outside of the Vue app controlled part, this will do nothing. The browser will ignore it. But inside of our main app, Vue will understand this. It will understand this component because we registered this component to our main app with the component method by giving it that exact identifier, which I'm now using as a HTML tag in my template. And that's why we should use a non-default HTML tag name here, because if we would have named our component h2, Vue would not recognize it as a custom component, of course. But since we have such a name with a dash in it, a two-word name, which is this identifier we used here, Vue detects that here, in the end, we want to render this mini app with its template and all the dynamic pieces in the template. So now if we save this again and reload, we see Manuel Lawrence on the screen. And we can click show details and hide details, and this just works. And now we can repeat that and simply add another component. And if I reload, we have Manuel Lawrence twice. And the important thing is, every Manuel Lawrence works standalone, totally detached from the other one. Now, of course, we have the same data twice now. That's something we're going to fix soon. But this shows you how components allow you to easily replicate an encapsulated piece of HTML code with, and that's the important part, with attached data and logic. So components are reusable pieces of HTML with connected data and logic. And that is very, very powerful, especially as you will soon see how we can also reuse one and the same component with different data that we pass into the component. That will be the next step, which will then really make components a powerful tool. But you can hopefully already see how a component helps us encapsulate structure, content, and logic into small, reusable pieces. And you can really add as many of these components here as you want, and they will all be rendered and they all work standalone. So now we got a bunch of Vue mini apps in the same main app. And these apps will then also be able to communicate with each other, to share information, and hence will have the best of both worlds. Encapsulated, isolated pieces of code which also makes it easier to work on that code in case you have bigger projects. And at the same time, we can combine all those isolated pieces to build a bigger app from them. Now that are components, and they will be super important, and we're going to use them throughout the rest of the course. But at the same time, we're now already reaching a part where this setup we used thus far has certain limitations. We'll have more and more code in the same file, and writing templates like this in such a string form, that will not be very nice to do. In addition, we of course also need to learn more about components so that we can really make this component reusable and also work with different data, so that the component acts like a shell to which we can pass different data. We'll take care of all of that in the next modules.